Okay, everyone. So I didn't want your Monday to go to waste without a little bit of guidance on how to read your sources, particularly your primary sources, especially because I wanted you to be able to know um, what to look for, what to examine, and um, how to take notes, how to, ask yourself questions, what kind of questions to ask, and what to make note of, and even how to take those notes and how to keep yourself organized. So that's what this is all about, and that's what we would have talked about if we could meet on Monday. So when we talk about reading and taking notes from your sources, this is going to focus on primary sources with some mention of secondary sources, just because we started looking for secondary sources on Wednesday. But this is primarily focusing on primary sources and what all that includes. So let's start with some of the basics at looking at your primary source. So I start with identifying the source. And when I talk about what it means to identify the source, of course, you start with, literally identifying the source. Like, what is this source? Is it an image? Is it, somebody's diary? Is it a letter from one person to another, or one person to an organization, or an organization to an individual? Is it a letter? Is it a song or lyrics of a song? Is it a dress? Is what is this particular source? And um, when we talk about identifying this particular source, that's, um, you know, looking at it in the most superficial way, which you have to a certain extent done already. But when we talk about actually going into it further, what you have to do then is dig even deeper, right? Now you've got to go into what's actually happening in this particular source that's gotten your attention. It's not enough to say, okay, this is a photograph of a soldier, or this is the photograph of an individual, or this is the letter from the president to his chief of staff, or this is the letter from. A letter from the union to a worker on the line, who's trying to go on strike. It's got to be something more than that. You have to be able to explain what is actually happening in this particular source that is so significant, right? Is it a soldier who's in distress? Is it a soldier who's in pain? Is it a soldier who's um, in euphoria, experiencing joy? Is it a soldier at work? Is it a woman who is caring for her children? Is it a woman at work? Is it a woman who is writing a letter to her husband at war? Is it a young person who is listening to music? What is the context of what takes place here? What is happening in this particular source that is explaining what's going on here? Is it the president writing out specific orders that needs to be carried out, or is the president thanking someone for their service? Whose voice do you hear here? Um, is it one of sorrow? Is it angry? And even if you can't identify the individuals involved, can you at least describe what is happening? Can you describe, the types of things that you see? Is it something that represents advanced technology for the time? Is it something that represents power and strength? Is it something that is representative of um, military advancement? Is it something that is representative of war? Is it something that is representative of, what people are capable of, in desperate times? That's what you want to be able to do. Like, you want to be able to dig far more than you have before. This is not something that is uh, a cursory glance, right? You're not doing a superficial examination, or a skimming of your source. This is an in-depth reading, or an in-depth analysis, or an examination of your source, whether it's a letter or a journal or a photograph, or someone's recollection of their experience. You are wanting to basically go through these sources with a magnifying glass, and you want to be able to know these sources intimately. You want to demonstrate that you have really sort of gone through everything, and investigated it like you were a detective, because that's exactly what you are. You want to expose everything. You want to be able to demonstrate that and understand who these individuals are, and who is experiencing what, and what they're going through. And in doing so, you can then tie them to the larger event, or the larger situation that you are studying, whether it is the Dust Bowl, or a war, or a political event. You want to be able to tie them to those larger things, because that's really what our responsibility is, right? We are responsible for creating this understanding between humanity and these larger intangible events. That's the historian's responsibility, right? It's not just that things are happening to people. It's that people are tied to each other. People are tied to these larger events. Um, everything happens to everything, and everybody happens to everybody, right? So when we talk about, the Dust Bowl, for example, because that's fresh on my mind, one of the things that people don't realize is that every political decision, every economic decision, um, all of those things had an impact on very real people. And those decisions don't just happen to people who are uh, just going to sit there and take it. They have voices, and they have opinions, and they express those opinions. They express it vocally, they express it in their diaries, they express it in their letters, and it's your responsibility to talk about those, and interpret those, and write those down. When a war comes, or when political decisions are made, or when a cultural shift takes place, when a new type of music takes over, and young people obsess over it, or a new type of fashion comes into trend, people flood the stores and start to listen to it, or start to buy it. All of these things are things that are reflected in how people live and work, and communicate. And that's what you want to be able to demonstrate in your writing, right? You want to be able to show that you can see in these sources, that you can read and understand, that you can see how people are affected by these events, whether it's cultural events, or political events, or economic events. You can see that people are changed and shaped by those things, and that in reverse, people shape those events as well, right? People's decisions shape those events. And those things matter, right? When we talk about these questions, one of the things that also matters here is knowing when these sources are created, right? So, if you are talking about, say, for example, you were writing about the use of the atom bomb in World War II, and you had an image of the pilot who flew the plane that dropped the bombs that fell on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Um, or you had a copy of the interviews or an interview with them. Not that this exists, but like an idea of a conversation or a diary entry. That is incredibly powerful to know that you would have that pilot's words written somewhere, and to know that it was his words after those bombs were dropped, and asking questions like, what was he feeling, what was he thinking, was he shaped by those decisions, if so how, and what did it do to his mentality, or how did it shape his career afterwards. Those sorts of things can be shaped by questions like when the source was created. And then once those questions are answered, you can then address this question, and that is whether or not the source really matters, right? Because sometimes you will run into this conundrum of having a couple of sources that you aren't really going to use. You may find it interesting, but not necessarily important to your research. And that's okay. I mean, here's the thing. I have a collection of binders filled with pages and pages of notes, and copies, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies of pamphlets and flyers and all and testimonies, congressional testimonies, and all sorts of stuff that I was planning on using for my dissertation. And none of that came to fruition, simply because my dissertation in the end went a different direction than I originally intended. It didn't mean that those sources were a waste. It just meant that what my research did was take a shift. My intention in the beginning was to do one thing, but then it took a slightly different direction. So many of my sources worked, but some of them did not. And so I've held on to them because I'm convinced I'm going to use them at some point in some way. But in the meantime, I just didn't. I haven't used them. And that's okay. So, if you can, when we talk about why a source is important, you have to be honest with yourself. You have to be honest and ask yourself, does this source add to your understanding of the topic? And I would add to this particular question, does it add to your understanding of the topic in a meaningful way? In a way that you know is going to contribute to your research paper. Now, if you just find it interesting, then great. I'm glad that you did. I have many sources that I found really fascinating, and um, I'm glad I've held on to them, but that does not mean that I needed to use them for my dissertation. There was just no space for those things. That's the same way I feel for you. You may not necessarily have space for them in your paper, but I'm glad that you find them interesting. That's the thing that I want you to keep in mind. The other thing that I want you to remember is you also want to keep this in mind too. Like, why did this source grab your attention? Why did it jump out at you? Did you lean towards this source just because you were desperate for sources, or did it grab your attention because you legitimately saw this source? You saw the headline, you saw the image, um, or you saw this collection and you thought, "Oh my god, this is something that is definitely, something that I will need, for, the for the project itself." That's that's incredibly important. Now, the other question that you have to ask yourself, and this is something that you're going to have to ask yourself not only for primary sources, but especially for secondary sources. And that is, what does this have in common with your other sources? Um, is this addressing, like for primary sources, when we talk about, let me go back for a second. When we talk about primary sources, one thing that stands out, um, among primary sources is, you know, questions like, are the people that I'm reading about, for example, are they experiencing the same thing? Or are the people that I'm looking into, are they using the same type of rhetoric? Are are the people that I'm looking into, are they justifying, spending this much money for the same kind of reason? Or how do they justify spending this kind of money? Or how do they justify this war? Or how do they, um, what are the reasons for, expanding the military in this way? Or, what are the things that they have in common? What are the um, commonalities, in these sources? When you, especially when you are looking at, individuals, and you're studying, what people are experiencing, finding commonalities among experiences is a really interesting, thing to look for. The common experiences, are really important, but even finding, commonalities in rhetoric, what people say or how people say those things, rhetoric being, especially in political language, is really interesting. When we talk about, diplomatic language, or how people campaign, or cultural language and the things that, people use, whether it's in, music, or maybe it's in, how people are, creating their own lifestyle or that sort of thing. When we talk about those issues that come up, the way that they sort of justify or explain themselves, you'll see that there are a lot of common threads. And in secondary sources, you'll find out that you'll you'll see historians use or refer to a lot of common themes as well, right? This idea that, um, when you're studying, a specific topic, in history, or in your history of, say, the Civil War, or if you're studying, the Jazz Age, and you've noticed that, um, some historians are talking about, um, you know, uh, perhaps they're um, talking about racial, segregation, or, perhaps, some of them are catching on to this sort of, talking about the Harlem Renaissance, but within the Harlem Renaissance, they're focusing specifically on, uh, writers and their emphasis on, the rise of young people and their use of certain, language characteristics and that sort of thing. I mean, these are themes that, you can pick up on and, talk about in your writing. That's what you want to pay attention to. If you notice that among your secondary sources that more than one historian is talking about, certain aspects of politics, certain aspects of, economic issues, certain aspects of cultural values. Those are the common themes that you'll want to talk about in your writing, because you want to be able to demonstrate that, this is not something that, you know you're making up. You want to be able to demonstrate that it's something that's showing up everywhere in the sources. Now, I want to show you something that I've been working on, because I want to demonstrate that this is something that historians will always work on. It's not just you in this capstone class. This is a constant um, a constant thing that all historians work on. So I have been, I am in the process of editing an article, and this has been a long, ongoing saga. Let's just not get me started on this. At some point, I'll tell you the story. But so I just want to show you kind of what my process is. Just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm working on. So I've been working on an article that, long story short, and not an even entirely, this is not even the entire story, but a part of the article is about how Oklahoma ratifies. Votes to ratify the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. And uh, I used a collection of sources from this is the Harlow's Weekly. Harlow's Weekly is a political newspaper that was published in the early 20th century here in Oklahoma City. And it was, as you could see under the title there, it's Harlow's Weekly, a journal of comment and current events from Oklahoma, or for Oklahoma. But it was published out of Oklahoma City, and it was supposed to be this political commentary essentially from all over the state. And I looked at the issues published from 1918 to 1920, and I wanted to show you an example of one of the issues in particular, and this one was from March of 1920, specifically on the special session of the state legislature that voted to ratify the amendment. So I um, read the article, which is pictured there. This is the first page of the article, conveniently on page one. So I wanted to show you some of the notes that I took on it, and these aren't all of my notes on the article. It's just some of the notes that I wanted to show you. But essentially, if you look at the top part of it, I have most of the citation, not all of it. I've got Harlow's, not Harpo, Harlow's Weekly, italicized, the date, volume number, and volume and the number. What is not included is that it was published in Oklahoma City. I have the title uh, of the article, but it's obviously underneath there. So if I were to put it in a footnote, I would include the title of the article, obviously. And also the page number, right? When I would, if and when I were to cite it. But if you also notice in my notes, I have done a couple of things, and this is only to show you what works for me. I want to be really specific about this because the way I do it works for me. The way you do it needs to be whatever style works for you. You know what is best for you. So do that. This is what works for me because this is just how my brain works. This is what helps keep my head organized. Um, the thing is like I need a lot of structure. If I don't have a lot of structure, um, just to help you understand how my brain kind of functions, I get confused really easily and I feel overwhelmed. And just so you understand, you know, especially with the amount of sources I work with and the amount of notes that I take, it's really easy for me to feel overwhelmed. And then when I feel overwhelmed, I want to quit. So I'm I'm easily like I have to structure everything and I have to organize things very carefully. And that's important for you to remember because we're going to talk about that in a minute. So, I've organized things in this way because this just helps me. If I see it like this, I'm breathing easier. So you'll notice that throughout these notes, I've basically summarized most of what I see on this front page. That's everything that I have here. And then I've only quoted two things. Okay. Um, what I've done is I've basically summarized what this article is about. So, for example, I have there towards the middle of this little page is that, what did they accomplish, or essentially what is it that they wanted to get done? Those were the three things, but I put in boldface that they ratified women's suffrage amendment, which is why this particular article was important to me. Why is this source? Um, why is this particular article or this source significant? It's because this is the one that tells me that they ratified the women's suffrage amendment. And at the very top, I've quoted essentially the very first sentence of the article. And the reason why I quoted it is because it points out that this was the shortest session that the legislature had ever had in the history of the state. And basically it's a session that lasted for a week, and they were able to do these three things, which is, knowing this legislature, it's remarkably really, really, I mean, just it's incredibly important. So then, going into actually ratifying the amendment, the other thing that I quoted was the fact that they had these plans to ratify the federal suffrage amendment, and the fact that it worked out without a hitch. I underlined that because um, trying to get it to this place of even a special session had come with a tremendous amount of political drama. There were very public calls on the governor for a special session. President Wilson had to send a telegram. I mean, it was very political, very loud. There were a lot of debates. It was just a lot of chaos, and there was a lot of doubt on whether or not there would be a special session. And so, with all of that, um, the fact that once the special session came into play, the fact that it, quote, worked out without a hitch was crazy. And so then that led me to this very last question that I posted there. What made the idea of ratification so much easier to accept? Um, and that's where I was like, okay, how come, once it's there, everything goes so swiftly? And it made me realize I've got a lot more to explore and to dig, and that sort of thing. This idea that, we can get to the narrative is um is important, but it's also the realization that you can't just tell the story that these sources are telling you. You have to interpret it, and you have to ask questions. Like, I was able to see in the previous issues of Harlow's Weekly that there's all of this debate about getting to the special session. And it wasn't just Harlow's Weekly. There were issues of the Daily Oklahoman. There were letters to the governor. There were multiple telegrams back and forth to Washington, D.C., and all of these things about special sessions and why there would or wouldn't be, and all of these issues and debates about states' rights versus the right for women to vote on a national scale, and all of this stuff. And knowing how hotly debated this issue was, why did it suddenly come to a stop as soon as this special session came about? Like, it just made me so curious, like, what happened here, right? That's the thing, like, if you know that there's so much going on, if you know the story, how does it become so easily resolved? I want you to think of yourself as detectives. Think of yourselves as people, not just like you're, you know, you're just sort of telling a narrative, or you're reading what's on the what's on the page. You have to ask why, and then you have to answer that why. You have to be able to explain it. You're putting the puzzle together. That's the kicker. And in order to do that successfully, it's key that you keep yourself organized, right? Um, you've got to be able to keep your notes and keep those notes organized. And so I'm going to give you um, big um, three big ideas that I got from the University of Reading, that really helps. That's going to be really helpful to you, no matter what style of note taking you follow. These are three big things that are going to be very important for you. First of all, be meticulous, and I want to explain what meticulous means. So, meticulous is defined as showing great attention to detail and being very careful and precise. But I want to explain that further, because some people will say, okay, great attention to detail means writing everything down, and that is not what it means. Meticulous, to further explain that, means I want you to be intentional. Be intentional on what you're writing down. Be specific on what you're trying to get out of your source. Choose carefully and choose wisely. Don't write everything down, because you don't have to, right? If I go back to the previous slide, notice that even in this first page, so all of these things, with the exception of that last question, um, everything that I have written there is essentially from that first page. I didn't quote everything. The I've read the entire article, from the first and second page, because it's a multi-page article, but I just wanted to be able to get the general sense of what took place. And I wanted to be able to know, okay, what can I quote? What should I quote? And what can I leave out? The idea is I needed to get the narrative right. I needed to just know what's going on, and why I needed to keep going. What was it that I needed to um, uh, really pay attention to, right? So be intentional about what it is that you're keeping note of. That's the real point, right? The other thing that you need to do is keep your notes organized and keep them easily identifiable. So when you're taking your notes, what I would not do is write them all one right after the other in a random notebook, and then just go to wherever they are in a notebook and hope that you find them. The reason why I wouldn't do that is just because um, it's one thing to do that while you're in the library, and if you go home right after and type them up, okay, that's fine. But if that's how you're doing all of your notes, the problem with that is it becomes hard to follow when it's time to actually read through your notes. Um, and it also becomes really tiresome, right? You wanna be able to know that, let's say, for me, for example, I had, I've got notes from the Kate Bernard collection. I have the Harlow's Weekly collection. I have notes from the Daily Oklahoman, from a collection of the Daily Oklahoman. I have, notes from different collections. If I had all of those collections jumbled up into one document or multiple documents, but they're all mixed together, it makes it impossible to find one particular source that has one particular quote that I really like, or a bit of information that I'm really looking for to contribute to one part of my article, or one, in your case, one part of your essay, right? So you want to keep your notes organized to where you know exactly what to find, um, or where to find what you want to find. So I have all of my notes from the Harlow Weekly in one folder, and I have all of my notes, and by folder I mean like online, or on in my laptop. And the same thing for my Cape Bernard collection, and the same thing for my Daily Oklahoman collection. It's just so much easier to keep organized. The other thing is that it really helps to take the time to type out your notes. Writing is fine because it means that you're engaging your brain, it means that you're reading carefully, and that's good. But when you are wanting to keep everything organized and keep everything separated, and you want to know, especially because, well, we'll get into this in a minute, but because you want to just keep everything searchable and all of that stuff, and easy to find, and you want to be able to have things readily available when you need them, taking the time to type out your notes just makes things so much easier for you later on. Also, as you type your notes, um, including the page numbers is so, so important, because if you keep track of your page numbers, even when you're paraphrasing your sources, um, if you need to go back and figure out where you got some information just for your own knowledge, or if you're trying to cite that in your paper and you're trying to figure out, okay, what page number was that I got that from, you have it right there in your notes and you don't have to go back to the source. It's really easy. It saves you so much time. You don't have to worry about flipping through your notebook. It's all right there. Uh, Again, so much time saved. Um, Also, when you type out your notes, and again, I didn't have this exactly the way that I should have in the notes that I showed you in Harlow's Weekly, in my Harlow's Weekly notes, but it was pretty close. But take the time to type out your sources according to Turabian. When you have it readily available like that, um, getting those typed out, so they're ready for your footnotes, is a matter of just copy paste. Literally. If you can just have, because all that was missing from my Harlow's Weekly citation was literally just including Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and the title of the article, as well as the page number. That's literally it, and that's my whole footnote right there. So having that ready, again, saves so much time. Just keep that in mind. Okay. When we talk about the quotes, here's the thing. Be very picky. You have to be very picky because not everything is a quotable. You have to be very picky about what you quote. Not everything is worthy of quotes. Um, when we talk about what's worthy of a quote and what's not, a statistic, yes, absolutely cite it. Um, and w- but a quote is something that is just, it's got to be special, right? And when I tell you about this special session, for example, from Harlow's Weekly, I'll tell you what. Let me go back to that page really quick, if it'll let me go. So I can tell you right now, I am not going to quote, I did not quote either of these. Instead, I did quote, I quoted this second quote, but only this little section that was underlined. I believe I'll double check it, but because it's been a while, so I'll have to I'll have to double check it. But I think I only quoted the part that was underlined, and that's literally it. Um, I you have to be very picky about what you quote, because not everybody is a quotable person either. You know who's quotable? Theodore Roosevelt. He's someone who is quotable. Abraham Lincoln, that's somebody who is quotable. Somebody who is quotable is someone, who is, really just a unique speaker, or if there is a letter, from a regular person who is describing in the most unique, most effective way what is going on in the most dire of situations, then yes, absolutely quote them. If you cannot find a better way to describe what is going on in the middle of Japan in 1945, then yes, absolutely use that quote. But if you can, if there are multiple ways that have described that area during that time, then no, don't use it. Don't use a quote. I mean, find something else. The thing is uh, use your quotes discriminately and identify those quotes now. Like, find those quotes now and make sure you have the correct citations. But don't quote everybody all the time. That's the main thing. Okay, so the second big piece of advice I would give you, and so with the University of Reading, is be accurate. Be accurate, and here's what that means. To be accurate is to mean that you need to stay true to what works best for you and what you've been doing throughout this process. That means in every possible way. Take notes the way that works best for you. Now, you guys saw what works best for me. If that doesn't make sense to you, then don't do that. What works for you, then do it that way. If writing things down makes sense to you, great, do it that way. If getting a notebook for each source, each collection makes sense to you, do it that way. If you know, uh, recording your notes works best for you, do it that way. I literally don't care, but you need to stay true to what works best for you. You have to do that. Because this is a process that has to be entirely yours in the end. The other thing that stay accurate is about, or be accurate is about your writing voice. Too many times, uh, when it comes to research projects, we run into people who are trying to become somebody else when they write. I am not interested in reading your project as you try to write like Maya Angelou. I No, you are not Maya Angelou. Dr. Angelou wrote like herself, which is why she was Dr. Angelou. So leave her alone. I'm not interested in that. I am interested in what you have to write, what you have to say, what you have to contribute. You cannot write like me, and I cannot write like you. And that's okay. That's how it's supposed to be. You have your voice, and I have my voice. I can improve quite a bit, and you can improve quite a bit. And that's the goal, right? The goal of this entire class is for us to learn how to research, learn how to um, you know, uh, analyze, learn how to interpret, and learn how to produce, to synthesize and produce projects, um, and to demonstrate that we can think, read, and write critically. That's the whole point. And you have to do it in your voice. Be true to that. That's the whole point. Um, I don't know why that's there, so ignore that. We've already talked about that. Okay, last, this is about being active. And here's what being active is all about. Be active means be active in how you research. Active note taking is better than passive note taking. So let me explain what passive note taking is first. And if you uh, can relate to any of these, if you feel convicted by these, then please stop doing these things and start doing the other things. Okay. So passive note taking is things like this. When you are um, looking at your research, whether it's primary or secondary, it applies to both. And all you do are things like underline words, or you circle words, or you draw arrows. Or better yet, if you just cut and paste from online documents. Um, or when you do things like when you are reading an online source and you're just typing up word for word what the author is saying. So you're just basically copying a lot of direct quotes, and you're not actually putting things into your words. So you're not paraphrasing anything, and you're not, um, putting things into your own words. You're not thinking about what you're reading. You're not really considering what you're looking at. You're just quoting. It's just quote after quote after quote. And then on top of that, you're taking notes on literally everything you read. It means then that if you are a passive note taker, it means that you're not putting thought into what you are reading, whether it's a primary source or a secondary source. If you're looking at an image, for example, and all you can say is, well, he's wearing a uniform, and he's at a bus stop. Okay, what kind of uniform? Where is the bus stop? What does it how do you know it's a bus stop? Where was this taken? When was it taken? If it shows me little to no analysis, it means that you've made little to no effort. You're not giving it any thought, you're not giving it any type of effort. There is no interpretation whatsoever. That's passive interpretation, right? There's no analysis. Whereas if you are actively um, interpreting, if you are in active note taking mode, then that means that from the very beginning, you are thinking about what you want to get out of your project, right? You are thinking about your source, and you are thinking about the what you can get out of your source, right? You are being intentional about your research, and you are being intentional about your searches. You are being intentional about your reading. You're being intentional about your note taking. Ask yourself what it is that your source is telling you. Ask yourself why the photographer took that picture. Ask yourself why the person wrote that song. Ask yourself why that person wrote that letter, why they wrote that journal entry. And let your questions drive your research. Let your questions drive your reading. Why did this historian write this article or write this book? Let those questions drive you. Be intentional. And then in that intention, look for the connections. Look for, okay, I've seen this image. I've asked myself these questions. I've considered what these sources are. Now, what do they have in common with the other sources I've seen, with the other sources I've read, with the other sources that I have? What do they all have in common? What are they telling me about what I know about this time period and this place? Um, and then when you take your notes, uh, let those notes be in your words. I think a part of the problem with our note taking is that when you put your notes in other people's words, it's because you don't trust yourself. And so you're letting other people decide for you or tell you what's going on instead of you telling yourself. But that's not the point of this class. You've gotta say it. You've gotta be the one to tell yourself, "Okay, here's what's happening. Here's what this lady is experiencing. Here's what this family is going through. Here's what's going on. Here's why the president is giving these orders at this time, or here's what's happening." and here's what's causing this amount of anguish during this particular, experience. That's that's your job. Your job is to interpret, and it's your job to put it in your words. You have to trust your instinct. And that's been the message from the very beginning of this semester, right? To trust your instinct. And now, not only should you trust your instinct, you need to be intentional and be purposeful and actively do your part, because from this point on, now we're going to actually start putting things onto paper and see what works and what doesn't. And this is where we're really going to figure out um, what actually matters and what's actually going to lead to your real research project.